There are stories from war that do not begin with explosions, rushing tanks, or the roar of aircraft. Some begin with stillness so complete that the world seems afraid to make sound. In the summer of 1943, in a neglected swamp between scattered forests and a narrow river, a single reconnaissance scout lay submerged in cold water, unseen by anyone on either side of the front. His mission was not to strike, not to fire, not even to move. He had been sent to listen, to watch, and above all, to endure. For 3 days he remained there, not hiding from fear, but hiding so others would not die. He felt no heroism, only hunger gnawing at his stomach, cold creeping into his joints, insects burrowing into his skin. For 3 days, he measured time not by hours or sunlight, but by the intervals between enemy patrols. The swamp became both his camouflage and his prison. He could not stretch his legs, could not scratch at the bites, could not cough or whisper or even take a deep breath. Every movement carried the risk of discovery, and discovery meant more than death. It meant failure. He was armed with nothing more lethal than patience, a pencil, and a wet map clutched beneath his chest. And while whole divisions clashed, while cities burned and history shifted, the outcome of a small but decisive operation rested on a man who did not fire a single shot. This is not a story of victory through strength. It is a story of victory through endurance. A war won, in part, by those who learned to suffer in silence. The summer of 1943 found the frontline war-weary but unbroken, stretching from the broad steppes north of the Don, across rivers swollen by spring thaw, and into the low, soggy marshlands of the Policia region. There, amid mires, reeds, and bog-choked forest glens, the soil retained water from half a year's rainfall, the surface pocked with pools, hidden streams, and moss-covered hummocks. The war had already stalked these lands for many hard months. Ground saturated from winter snows, spring thaw, and heavy rains meant that foot travel was difficult, even near the cleared roads and forest tracks, but away from them, in the marshes, movement became nearly impossible. Visibility was poor, the mist rose at dawn and clung to the reeds until midday. Sound was dampened by dense vegetation. For these features, marshy terrain was at once a refuge and a trap, an environment both to be feared and to be mastered. It was into that terrain that a reconnaissance team of the Soviet infantry undertook a mission in early July 1943. The unit was ordered to glean information about a suspected German defensive strongpoint straddling a narrow, sluggish river that cut through a swampy fen. Our subject, a single scout, was chosen for a covert observation post. The commanding officers judged him capable, physically hardy, quiet, accustomed to long watches, with a record of disciplined endurance under fire. Known for his slender build and calm steadiness under stress, he was well suited to slip quietly into watery ground, remain still for interminable periods, and resist discomfort, hunger, cold, or mosquitoes. He took that risk upon himself so that others would not have to. He moved out just as stars faded into the gray hush of pre-dawn, slipping away from the small detachment's camp nestled near the forest edge, where pine and birch sheltered tents and whispered in the breeze. Under the faint light of a waning moon, he carried no heavy load, just a light waterproof cape, a small entrenching tool, a compass, a folded map, dry bread and a small piece of hard sausage, a canteen of water, and a means of signaling back, a little mirror, to reflect sunlight or moonlight. He also carried a small notebook and pencil, to mark enemy positions once observed. He moved slowly, carefully, step by step, listening to forest sounds, feeling the ground underfoot, avoiding the brittle crack of drying reeds, avoiding sinking too deep. At first light, he came to the edge of a reedy creek, water no more than ankle deep, but soft, sucking, uncertain. He stripped off his boots, rolled up his pant legs, and stepped in. Immediately the cool swamp water seeped over his feet. Tiny fish darted, insects broke the surface, and reeds slapped against his legs. He pressed forward, testing every step with his entrenching tool, gently probing for solid ground, feeling his leg disappear into the mire. A false step, and he would sink to mid-thigh or deeper. In that moment, he embraced the swamp, motionless, he let his weight settle only as far as safe. Inch by inch he dragged himself through the reedy water, until he came to a stretch of slightly firmer ground, a mossy hummock partially hidden beneath thick marsh grass. He used his cape, spread over some reeds and logs, to fashion a crude blind. He lay down, belly flat, and pulled the cape over himself, tucking it around so that only a narrow slot remained in front of his eyes. He placed the map, weighted by small stones, before him, and traced with his finger the lines of forest, marsh, river, the same terrain over which he flopped face down, motionless. He raised his head only enough to peer through the slot. Over the first hours, nothing moved. Morning mist crept across the marsh. The reeds flickered in a slight breeze, the creek beyond slithered silently under fallen logs, and birds, unseen, called deep in the forest. He strained to catch any sound of movement, distant footsteps, the echo of boots on wood, the rasp of rifle bolts, the low hiss of men speaking German, anything. But the swamp held its breath. He remained there through the first half of the day, hardly moving, allowing sun and insects to pass over him, water wallows shifting gently beneath him with each micromotion, mosquitoes landing on bare skin, biting, hardly felt at first, but mounting. He had no shelter other than the cape, no ability to shift without giving away his position. The heat increased. Already the swamp water was cool but not cold, under his body a thin film of mud cooled his belly, but elsewhere sweat gathered. He tasted bread dry in his mouth, the tiny sip of water in the canteen sufficed only for thirst, never enough to feel quenched. Still he waited. By late afternoon, the masts of tall reeds near the far bank shuddered. A slender reflection appeared on the water beyond, a pair of boots. He lowered his head, shifting only his eyes behind the slot. Two figures in German uniform stepped onto a faint track that skirted the swamp, rifles slung, helmets glinting in the dying light. They paused, stood motionless, scanning the reeds. One reached out, touched a stalk, and then both walked inland toward the forest. Heart pounded, breath slowed and then held. But the reeds did not stir more than by the breeze, the light cloak of mist hid him utterly. He waited a full quarter hour after their passage before daring to raise his head a little more, nothing. Then, with pencil and map, he traced their path, small dots marking boots, arrows signifying movement, lines for border of marsh, location relative to river, forest edge, rough distances. As night fell, he remained still, though cold seeped into him. The water under his chest, the thick marsh air, early evening chill combined. He thought briefly of returning, but to crawl back now would risk detection, either from bowing reeds or the glint of metal, or worse, from some German patrol crossing near the swamp. Better to wait until dawn, update observations, then withdraw. He bit the bread, stale, but coarse, and sipped water. Twice he rotated his legs slightly to ease cramps, but only just enough to avoid a telltale shift. He heard far-off thunder, echoed from distant artillery. Once, a half-whined cry of a distant bird. Closer, the rasp of a frog, the splash of water. But no human voice, no engine, not even the stumble of wood on wood. Night deepened. The stars overhead were invisible behind low clouds and mist. He felt utterly alone, separate from time, conscious only of his own breathing, heartbeat, the slow drip of dew from cape folds onto his face, into his eyes. When dawn came again, pale and gray, he had to decide whether to move. Another night in such posture might break his body, yet to surface now would risk exposure to anyone waiting, a scout, a patrol, for a German detachment. He waited until light rose enough to see the far shore. Then, very gradually, over many long minutes, he shifted his weight, rolled onto one side, then onto his back, sliding slowly along the hummock, letting water and mud carry him, to avoid any snap or sudden movement that might display his shape through the cloak. Once he was free of the hummock, he lay face down again in shallow water, deeper than before but still only mid-waist. He tied off his cape as best he could and repositioned his head to peer through a new slot. On the map he marked the position of the previous day's spotted track, and began scanning again, the forest edge, the river beyond, open water shimmering between reeds. With binoculars he saw nothing, but he heard the faint click of rifle bolts, men murmuring, the shuffling of canvas over wood as the enemy worked on bogged-down wagons. A little way off, among a cluster of trees by the riverbank, he glimpsed the shape of a half-sunken wagon, wheels half embedded in mud, a crate tied beside it, gaiters strewn near it. 2 men stood near the wagon, but their faces were hidden, their rifles rested on their shoulders. He forced himself not to blink, not to breathe too deeply. Pride in record, in steadiness, threatened to make his breathing audible. He froze in the hum of the swamp, letting the rodents, frogs, and mosquitoes be louder than he. He watched them load the crate onto the wagon, lash it down with rope, slowly shift the weight so the wheels sank further into mud. Then the men stepped back, looked upstream, listened. He felt sweat trickle in rivulets down his temple, mosquitoes bit numbers around his face, his throat was dry, his belly ached. He pulled a ring of mud from his cap and smeared it across his cheeks, on he had no paint. Mud as camouflage, the dark swamp muck absorbed light, reflected none. He moved not a muscle, saw them retreat into the forest beyond, heard distant laughter, German voices, soft, muted. As soon as they vanished, he recorded on the map the position, relative to a birch tree stump, the river bend, the sunken wagon, the faint trail. All through that second day the marsh remained silent. He heard only wind in reeds, water shifting in small eddies, mosquitoes buzzing. Every few hours his legs cramped, his calves seized, hamstrings tightened. Cold seeped upward. At midday the sun broke through clouds, strong, hot, but the dense swamp air prevented full warming, sweat cooled quickly, chill returned. He drank sparingly, sipped water to moisten lips, but not enough to make his movements less stealthy. He ate the last bite of sausage with a swallow of nearly cloudy water, just enough to keep his stomach from empty ache. He thought of home, briefly, of a wooden house before war, of a mother's voice, of warm food, but not enough to lose focus. In the marsh there was no room for longing, only waiting. He thought of the comrades he had left behind in the forest camp, the officers poring over maps by lantern light, trying to guess enemy positions, to plan an advance. Their safety now depended on his silence, on the details he could fetch from that swamp. He thought of them and forced himself to stay calm. Late in the afternoon, on the third day, just as the sun began its slow descent, he noticed movement on the far bank of the river, 3 men, a few yards apart, moving slowly among trees. Rifles ready, they paused on the bank, looked out over water, listened. He shrank lower, the blind of cape and reeds flickered. He pressed his face into mud, but kept his eyes above, behind the narrow slot. They remained for minutes, then one raised binoculars, scanning upstream. The others followed with their eyes. He did not flinch. Then one man suddenly looked directly toward his hiding spot. For a heartbeat, maybe 2, he thought they had seen him. He heard something crack, a reed, perhaps broken by shifting breeze, or by the man's foot. The 3 moved closer. One knelt at the water's edge, peering, the other 2 shifted, strain in their posture. He sensed the danger, movement, looking, hearing something from the reeds. He barely thought, his mind narrowed to one grim determination: do not move. Then something glimmered, not more than a flash, at the water's surface, maybe half a meter from the bank. The kneeling man reached forward, water splashing, fingers brushing mud. Maybe he was retrieving something lost, a cap, a glove, a helmet. The other 2 stood tense at the edge. He held his breath. The gleam remained for a moment, then disappeared under mud. The men looked at each other, cursed softly in German, one gestured. They rose, walked uphill into thick trees and undergrowth. He waited a long while after their departure, pencil trembling, and made his final mark, a rough triangle where he judged enemy sentries posted along the river bank, indicating direction of guard rotation, distance to faint forest track, the wagon stuck in mud, and likely river crossing point used by supply wagons. Night fell again. He did not dare to move until starlight grew strong. He dragged himself off the hummock, sliding belly down in mud, knees first, arms pulling, each inch a small gamble that his body would not sink too deep, that muffled squelch of reeds would not betray him. At last he reached the reedy creek, felt its cold water move over his knees, waded slowly, boot by boot, then scrambled onto drier ground, pressed himself flat to the earth, removed cape, wrung water from it, tied it on his pack to dry later, wiped mud from face as best as he could, washed hands in a small pool. Then, crouched and silent, he began the long return. He moved slowly, deliberately, using compass bearings and river curves to orient, skirting known German positions, aiming for thick forest where path back would be safer. He avoided open ground. Twice he stumbled in soft dirt, legs sinking, boots half full with water and clay. He felt exhaustion sharp, bones heavy, calves trembling, but he forced foot after foot, hand after hand. He recalled old lessons learned in training: breathe slowly, keep weight distributed, avoid quick movement, keep head low, watch for sun flickers, avoid glint on metal. He told himself only what he needed: forward, silent, unseen. By dawn of the fourth day, more than 68 hours since he first slipped into the swamp, he emerged at the designated forest edge. Branches overhead blocked early light, pine needles cushioned his body as he lay flat, closed eyes, just to taste air that was dry, not thick with humidity, smell pine resin, feel shadows rather than reeds. After long minutes he rose, rubbed mud off skin, took off water-soaked clothes, wrung them, drank the last of water, ate dry bread crumbs. Then, with pack slung low, he walked slowly to the small collection of frost-tough tents where comrades lay sleeping or scratching notes by campfire ashes. He told no one anything, only laid beside his comrades, shivering but safe. Later that day the officers gathered over his map. He placed the paper on a log, points and lines traced in pencil. The commanding officer studied them quietly, then another officer lifted his eyes and looked at the scout's face, tired, stained with mud, eyes sad but calm. Without words they turned back to the map. Over the following days, using the scouts' observations, the infantry planned a flanking movement, avoiding the marsh crossing exactly where the Germans had posted guards, approaching instead from a wooded ridge beyond the swamp, to surprise the enemy's flank, cut supply routes by the sunken wagon, and seize the small bridge over the sluggish river. Within a week, their assault drove the enemy from that position. Many surviving veterans later testified, the reconnaissance moved smoothly, the enemy was caught off guard, the flank collapsed, and the road toward a forested ridge fell quickly. Losses among our side were minimal, confusion and disarray spread through German ranks. The success of that advance owed in no small part to the silent vigil of one lone man lying in a swamp for 3 days. In the following months the scout was awarded a modest commendation, a small strip of ribbon and a certificate noting exceptional endurance and bravery in intelligence duties. He seldom spoke of those 3 days. Among his comrades, few knew the full story. The swamp remained behind them, evaded, avoided. The war pressed on, with other battles, other sacrifices. But the memory of that reconnaissance lingered. In letters home, after the war, he described, once, briefly, only that he had sat, waiting, watching, listening, in waters cold and deep, alone, carrying a small notepad, for silence, for shadows. He did not say how many insects feasted on him, how often his calves cramped, how his belly ached for warmth, food, sunlight. He did not embellish. Yet those who read the tactical report, or later the after-action summary, understood. They saw the little triangle on the map, enemy guard positions, supply point, river crossing, and recognized the courage and self-denial required to secure that information. They realized that the victory gained with those lines on a map had not been won by tanks or great battles, but by a single man's stillness, patience, and refusal to abandon hope under worst conditions. For decades after the war, that scout returned to civilian life. The marshlands drained or cultivated, the forest regrew. The river slowed, then changed course. The wagons rotted, the tracks faded. Few knew about that mission. But among a small circle of veterans, the story remained, quietly told around fires, or in meetings, or in letters between comrades, a testament to the endurance of men under war. A testament to what a single human being could endure in mud and water, alone, invisible, so that others might survive and push forward. That single episode, 3 days in a swamp, unseen, unheard, alive only in breath and thought and pencil, stands among countless others, often unremarked upon. Yet it mattered. In the vast panorama of war, such acts of patient vigilance, of self-imposed isolation, of silent suffering, become the quiet threads that hold together plans, strategies, lives. They are not recorded in grand histories of battles or triumphs, they belong to personal memoirs, to small maps with little dots, to worn-out boots dried by campfires, to mud-stained faces of men who survived and seldom boasted. In remembering them now, with respect and calm, we honor not only the man who lay in swamp for 3 days, but all those who, in forest, fen, field, or trench, sacrificed simple comforts, warmth, hunger, thirst, safety, to give others the possibility of life, victory, return home. Their patience, endurance, courage, quiet, uncelebrated, deserve to be remembered, so that the roaring of battles and collapse of empires not drown the whispered names of those who carried the war in their flesh and memory. I will continue with Part 2, to carry the account through debriefing, aftermath, long-term consequences, and reflections, always striving to preserve the dignity and truth of the men who lived through those days. When he reached the forest edge and stepped onto the soil no longer saturated with water, his body resisted the shift. For 3 days, the swamp had been not an obstacle but an environment he had adapted to, and its departure from his skin and muscles happened slowly, as though the ground beneath him no longer offered the same silence. His boots, heavy with mud and moisture, rubbed raw against his feet. His legs trembled not from fear or cold, but from the memory of immobility, from muscles held too long in tension without release. The forest seemed loud to him, though it was merely the quiet noise of branches creaking mildly in the wind, pine needles settling from the passing of birds, and the distant scraping of metal on wood where someone cleaved firewood. After 3 days of swamp stillness, the ordinary rustle of forest life seemed almost intrusive. The scout remained a few steps away from the nearest tent, conscious that his odor, a pungent mixture of rot water, sweat, and stagnant algae, would announce him before he spoke. But no one reacted with surprise or disgust. Those who noticed him simply nodded, not out of casual respect, but out of understanding. Soldiers in that war knew the smell of places where survival demanded silence. Men carried with them the scent of trench mud, cattle barns in occupied villages, burnt forests, collapsed earthworks, flooded dugouts. The swamp was only one version of those places. His scent was not a marker of humiliation, but a quiet signal that a man had returned from the kind of assignment that required endurance more than force. He was directed to a makeshift bench near the campfire. A medic, without ceremony, set down a tin container of warm water beside him, along with coarse cloth for wiping. The scout did not speak. He sat, lowering his hands into the water, and watched the mud dissolve into it, turning the liquid brown and cloudy. Pulling the sleeves back from his forearms revealed pale, wrinkled skin marked with dozens of raised bites. Some had scabbed from minor bleeding, others were inflamed into small red mounds. His fingers, numb for hours, began to sting sharply as warmth returned, as nerves woke from cold suspension. Nearby, equipment was being repaired, boots were being greased, rifles disassembled, cleaned of residue, reassembled. No one rushed. War did not accelerate routine tasks. War demanded that routine become ritual, weapons must be cleaned, boots dried, uniforms kept in condition. Hunger could be endured, pain could be tolerated, cold could be suppressed, but a rifle jammed by neglect or boots ruined by moisture could get men killed as swiftly as bullets. The scout watched his comrades polishing weapon barrels and scraping mud from soles. Their movements bore no urgency, yet held absolute precision. It was the same discipline that had guided him through the swamp. He ate little. Only warmed broth at first. Solid food would strain a stomach that had been nearly empty for days. The liquid entered him slowly, as if his insides were relearning the act of nourishment. After consuming a few careful spoonfuls, he leaned against a pine trunk, blanket over his shoulders, and allowed the forest's warmth to sink into him. His breaths gradually deepened. His heart slowed from the rhythm of alert listening to the steadier cadence of rest. But though his body relaxed, his mind still lingered in caution. He did not close his eyes for long. Every sound in the forest demanded classification: wind, wood crack, step, breath, metal, animal. The swamp had conditioned him to survive through identification of faint disturbances. It took hours before the officers summoned him. They did not hurry. Commanders waited because haste brought errors, and reconnaissance could not depend on memory still flooded with adrenaline and deprivation. They allowed his mind to reconnect with land, fire, warmth, and speechlessness without threat. When he was called, he stood with slight stiffness and walked without limping, though pain remained in his feet. He entered the command tent carrying nothing but his notebook and the map that had remained with him through 3 days of humidity, pressure, and concealment. The tent was dim, lit by a single shielded lantern. The officers were gathered around an improvised table made from stacked ammunition crates. The scout set the map down gently. A corner of it tore slightly, moisture had weakened its fibers. One officer pressed a small weight, a stone taken from the fire pit, onto the upper edge of the sheet to keep it flat. The scout opened his notebook to supplement the map, revealing times, directions of light, average intervals between enemy patrols, approximate distance between sentry movements, and the distribution of logistics on the far bank. The officers studied the information silently. No questions were asked. As a principle, if information was unclear, it had no value. The clarity before them made questions unnecessary. They could decipher everything because his markings were not approximations of impressions, they were precise quantifications of intervals measured in suffering. Every detail on the map had cost him hunger, cramping muscles, and insect bites. Every line came from hours of stillness in water that never warmed, from a body that had refused to shiver because shivering would have caused movement. These facts were not written, but they were embedded in each pencil stroke. The officers recognized this implicitly. The scout did not watch their reactions, he observed their method. They transferred his lines to larger, freshly written charts, marking angles of advance, potential artillery targets, choke points for wagon movement, weak spots along the river crossing. They compared his notes to existing reconnaissance reports that came from aerial observation, but where those photographs had been blurred by tree cover and fog, his map was exact. The swamp had concealed him more effectively than any camouflage net, and therefore it had revealed truths that planes could not see. Only after the officers began arguing quietly over distances and directions, not out of disagreement, but out of refinement, did he step back. His presence was no longer required. The reconnaissance object had moved from the realm of personal endurance into collective strategy. The swamp was no longer inside him, it had become lines on a map that dozens, then hundreds of men would rely upon. He left the tent without looking back at the map. He had completed his task. In war, completion did not bring satisfaction, it brought transition. Returning to the campfire, he no longer smelled the swamp as intensely. The shifting air of the forest, mixed with smoke, began to replace the stagnant scent on his clothes. The blanket wrapped around him now served not for concealment, but for warmth. He heard normal breathing nearby, men asleep, unafraid. Crickets echoed between trees. The night did not demand silence from him anymore. His shoulders loosened slightly. His senses expanded outward instead of collapsing inward into survival mode. Before he allowed himself to sleep, a medic insisted he soak his feet in salted hot water. The scout obeyed, not out of comfort-seeking but because damaged feet threatened future missions. When the heat reached his swollen skin, pain flared sharply, more piercing than anything he had felt in the swamp. Only now, without threat, could pain fully express itself. The medic pressed a cloth over his legs to restore circulation, and the scout rested against the bench, feeling his body regain functions slowly forgotten. He slept in brief intervals through the night, waking twice with the reflex to raise his head at unfamiliar sounds. Each time, he found only routine noises, wood crackling, boots shifting, soft snoring. The swamp no longer demanded watchfulness. By morning, his breath no longer came in shallow, guarded bursts. His senses, though alert, no longer strained toward danger. With sunlight filtering through pine branches, he ate more substantial food. His body accepted it without rebellion. By the time officers began relaying orders based on the map he brought, the scout's pain had dulled to manageable stiffness. He remained quiet, not because he avoided speech, but because there was nothing more to say. His mission had left the realm of endurance and entered the logic of movement, artillery, and infantry coordination. He watched men prepare to march, and understood that those men were alive partly because he had refused to leave the water, even when his body demanded escape. He did not view this as heroism. In war, acts that saved lives rarely felt like noble deeds. They were tasks, burdens accepted without celebration. When his legs stopped trembling and his hands regained steady warmth, the swamp finally left him. Not through speech, not through memory, but through transformation of suffering into strategy. It was not relief. It was. The scout returned from the marshland without ceremony, carrying in his body the toll of 3 days of immobility, hunger, mud, and tension. His bones ached from long hours spent submerged in cold water, skin on his legs was whitened and wrinkled from dampness, reddened where mosquitoes had fed, and his muscles stiffened as if they were half frozen. Yet he refused medical inspection until the unit command completed the assessment of his maps and notes. The infantryman who saw him emerge from the forest edge in the early light hardly recognized him. Mud clung to his clothes like a second skin, and his movements were slow, deliberate, drained of strength. Still, he insisted on submitting the notebook first, as if the record itself mattered more than his condition. Only afterward did he accept hot soup, bandaging, and a bit of rest. War demanded quiet sacrifices just as much as loud ones, but the quiet ones rarely echoed through official accounts. In the week that followed, officers of the division worked over maps, using the reconnaissance data to redesign their approach toward the German defenses. The swamp, once seen as an obstacle, became a shield. By knowing where enemy guards had been placed, the infantry would avoid heavy fire. Instead of sending men to attack frontally across the boggy strip, commanders planned to turn around the marsh, cross the river upstream, and strike from behind. The destroyed wagon seen half sunken in mud marked a logistics weakness. Seizing that site would disrupt ammunition and food shipments across the area. Days later, the attack unfolded. Artillery bursts opened along the ridge beyond the swamp, not at the river crossing where Germans expected the main thrust. Under cover of artillery, Soviet infantry advanced through the forest, bypassing guard positions the lone scout had observed. By the time German forces attempted to realign their defense, their files were disrupted, their supply line partially cut. Resistance was still fierce. No assault in that war came without cost, but the defenders' shock at the unexpected direction of attack reduced casualties on the Soviet side, saving many lives. Veterans of that division would later recall the operation not as particularly glorious but as unusually efficient, a rare engagement in which careful planning spared battalions the attrition normally expected in swamp fighting. That efficiency stemmed not from luck, but from the written marks on a damp sheet of paper made by a man who spent days unblinking in mud. The scout himself did not dwell on this. Exhaustion settled into him as quietly as he had once settled into the swamp. His body resisted warmth at first, blood flowed sluggishly, and his legs cramped when placed near fire. The skin on his feet peeled, tender and blistered from constant immersion in cold water. He slept in brief intervals, waking intermittently during the first nights, as if expecting the rustle of reeds or the splash of steps nearby. In his dreams, the silence of the swamp persisted, not threatening, simply watchful, a presence without malice. He woke from such moments not in panic, but with a sense of unfinished duty, as though his observation had not yet ended. Medics recommended a few days of rest away from frontline assignment. The commanding officer agreed, but the scout requested to remain with his unit. He took no pride in that request, his reasoning was neither stubborn nor emotional. It was simply that he believed his presence was required. He had learned the nearby terrain, he understood its movements, its light, its danger. He saw no purpose in being moved elsewhere. The officer allowed it. In this war, men were not kept from duty if they could stand and breathe and hold a weapon. As the front line shifted further from the swamp, the forest around it regained its stillness. Shell impacts quieted, animals returned to the water's edge. Fallen branches sank deeper into wet soil, and abandoned German crates rotted near the sunken wagon. A few weeks after the battle, soldiers of the division had to pass that way again, and some recognized the muddy patch where the scout had lain. In the stillness, they saw nothing remarkable, just reeds, black moss, insects buzzing, and a drifting frog on the surface. Only those who knew the story could see anything else. The scout rarely narrated his part. When asked by a staff clerk to provide a written summary for the division log, he submitted a single factual description of terrain, observation hours, enemy guard rotation, and weather condition. He did not write about physical discomfort, or the danger of being discovered, or the long hours without movement. He did not mention hunger. He did not describe fear. He simply wrote the conditions under which the work was done: sustained immersion, limited nutrition, adequate concealment, minimal sleep. The report resembled a maintenance checklist more than a record of hardship. For him, it was not a story at all. It was a duty. Months passed, the war continued its violent motion westward, and like many soldiers whose courage was recorded in fragments, the scout's feat became just a line in the division archives. His award, though modest, was not forgotten by those who understood its weight. Yet he did not parade it. The ribbon remained stored in a tin box among a few personal items carried from camp to camp: a comb, letters from home, and a small photograph of his parents. For him, the honor was not the medal, but the knowledge that he had protected his fellow soldiers. When the war ended, his unit demobilized. Survivors dispersed back across villages, towns, and cities of a country devastated by conflict. The scout returned home after long transport through rail lines that crossed newly liberated lands, through fields still littered with wrecks of machines, through stations where refugees waited for trains that would carry them to uncertain futures. When he stepped onto the platform of his hometown station, there were no banners, no music, no ceremony. He carried a bag of military linen, his boots worn thin, and his body lean from months of rationing. Time had not erased the swamp from his posture, his movement was still slow and cautious, as if not to disturb a fragile silence. His family greeted him not with dramatic joy but with quiet relief. They understood, like many families, that the war had changed him in ways invisible to outsiders. He did not speak much of the front, and when neighbors asked him whether he had seen fierce battles, he answered that he had served in reconnaissance duties, nothing more. Few imagined what that phrase encompassed. For most civilians, reconnaissance meant spying from trees, binoculars on a ridge, silent observation from behind bushes. They did not imagine a man submerged for days in cold water without lifting his head, surrounded by insects, waiting for a chance to mark pencil lines on a soggy map that would save entire platoons. And since he did not wish to burden anyone with that truth, he simply let them keep their assumptions. Years turned into decades. The country rebuilt, monuments rose, ceremonies commemorated battles, and books recorded major offensives. Yet the small operations often went unmentioned. Veterans met occasionally, exchanging sparse, honest words, respecting each other's unspoken memories. When former members of his division gathered, they remembered the swamp operation. They spoke not about the scouts' suffering, but about the reality that such work had prevented heavy casualties. Those still alive did not exaggerate, they did not turn the story into legend. They told it plainly, acknowledging that the war was full of similar acts by men whose names were barely known. The scout aged. His body bore marks of those days in the swamp, chronic pain in his legs, recurring inflammation in the joints, occasional numbness in his feet when winter approached. Doctors later described these as vascular changes caused by prolonged cold immersion. He never connected these ailments to heroism, he accepted them as a cost of service. Veterans commonly carried lingering ailments, damaged lungs from damp trenches, impaired hearing from artillery blasts, weakened hearts from starvation or infection. He was not exceptional in this. His pain was not a badge. It was simply a reminder. He lived quietly, working modest jobs, raising a family, paying no attention to veterans' associations except when invited. When on rare occasions younger people asked him what he remembered most from the war, he gave simple answers: not battles, not medals, but silence. He would say that war was often quiet, waiting, listening, lying still, far more often than it was loud with rifles and explosions. He remembered the waiting most keenly, the stillness that had crushing weight. When someone laughed, thinking war always roared with noise, he did not correct them. The truth was not entertainment. As years passed, his story risked fading entirely. Only through the testimonies of comrades, preserved in local archives and recorded interviews, did fragments survive. One veteran described him as the calmest man I ever met, adding that his patience prevented needless deaths. Another recalled how the scout refused to take credit, stating only that anyone could have done it, though everyone knew that such endurance was rare. The swamp episode entered regional records, cited as an example in training manuals for reconnaissance units long after the veteran himself could no longer stand at ceremonies. In later life, when his children grew old enough to ask about the war, he did not glorify it. He spoke of responsibility, of doing what was necessary, of accepting discomfort for the sake of others. Only once did he mention the swamp to his eldest child, and he described it without drama. He said that it was wet and cold, and there were insects everywhere, but the silence mattered. He did not mention hunger or risk. He did not describe fear. He simply said that the silence mattered. When he passed away at an old age, his belongings were few. Among them, still in the tin box, lay the small ribbon awarded decades earlier. His children found the map too, the original one, creased and faded, with pencil marks nearly erased. The page still bore traces of swamp stain on one corner, and though the precise locations were blurred, the small triangle marking enemy guards remained faintly visible. They kept the map not as trophy, but as testament to something that could no longer be spoken by its owner. Later, when historians wrote about the division's operations, they included a brief note about the reconnaissance that aided the crossing. They did not give the scout's full name, respecting the archival practice of focusing on units over individuals. The summary remained factual, without flourish. Intelligence gained through prolonged concealed observation enabled a tactical shift that reduced casualties. But in their private correspondence, those historians acknowledged the human cost behind such phrasing. They understood the difference between a line in an official record and the lived experience of a soldier submerged in a swamp for days. Thus the story ends not with applause but with quiet recognition. The scouts' endurance did not reshape the war, did not bring swift victory, did not alter history's grand scale. Yet it saved lives, real men who would otherwise have fallen to machine gun bursts at a river crossing. It allowed sons to return home, fathers to survive another battle, comrades to see another dawn. It was an act of patience, invisible to most, but indispensable to those it protected. In remembering him and countless others like him, we do not elevate them into myth. We honor their truth, the truth of cold water and hunger, of silence held for the sake of others, of sacrifice measured not in glory but in endurance. These were the deeds that sustained armies, that allowed victories to occur, that held lines together when the world seemed determined to break them. Such endurance does not need embellishment. It needs remembrance. Quiet remembrance, honest and steady, like the man who lay alone in a swamp, unmoving, for 3 long days, so that his comrades could take one step safer toward home.